The Black Hawk dropped into forward operating base coast in a haze of dust and exhaust, its rotors whipping the air into a storm that blinded anyone standing too close to the landing pad. The Afghan sun pressed down with a weight of its own, burning through goggles and fabric as if nothing could block it. Soldiers waiting nearby had seen dozens of rotations, and the sight of another load of personnel stepping out of the helicopter did not usually draw attention. This time it did. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, 28 years old, with 8 years of service and 2 tours in Iraq already behind her, came down the ramp carrying the kind of load that made veterans pause. Her body armor was heavy enough, but strapped across her back was the M249 machine gun the infantry had nicknamed the Pig. Its thick barrel and frame made it an anchor of steel, one that normally took its toll on the biggest men in the squad. She walked with it, as if the weight was not something to debate, only something to carry. The dust cloud swallowed her boots as she reached solid ground. She adjusted the sling over her shoulder without ceremony and kept moving until the rotor wash eased off. Her presence, quiet and self-contained, drew more attention than if she had announced herself. A group of soldiers leaning near the sandbag wall exchanged looks, nudging each other with the kind of smirk that always came before a joke. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez stepped forward, his grin broad under the shadow of his helmet. He raised his voice loud enough for the whole pad to hear and said she would not be able to carry that pig for 2 clicks without falling apart. The words brought a ripple of laughter, the kind that soldiers always use to mask boredom and heat. Bets were called out from the group within seconds, some offering rations, some offering cash, all eager to test the new arrival who did not look like their picture of a machine gunner. Maria stopped just long enough to meet Rodriguez's eyes. Her expression never shifted, but her answer cut through the noise. She said he should make it 100. For a second there was silence. Then the laughter came back louder, with disbelief mixed in. Someone slapped Rodriguez's shoulder and said the new one had spirit. Another shouted that she would not make it past the first mile, but in the noise there were also glances that carried a different tone, curiosity creeping in among the mockery. The pig on her back was not just a weapon now. It was a burden everyone measured against her frame, a symbol of doubt they were eager to see confirmed. Flags near the command post whipped violently in the rotor wash as the Black Hawk lifted again, leaving the pad shaking in its absence. The ridges in the distance stood sharp against the clear sky, a reminder of where all those bets would eventually be tested. Maria Santos walked forward, without answering another word. The base settled into its restless night rhythm. Generators thumped with a low, steady hum, and the faint sound of voices drifted from the barracks where men laughed over stories or cards. Floodlights flickered across the chain-link fence, their glow cutting weak, yellow circles into the Afghan dust. Beyond the fence, the desert lay silent under a pale moon, ridges drawn in shadow. In the middle of the fitness yard, away from the noise and comfort of others, Maria Santos worked alone. The pig was strapped across her back with the sling tightened high, its barrel and receiver pressing into her shoulders like a second spine. She dropped into burpees, palms slapping gravel, boots scraping as she kicked back, then rose again with a push that sent sweat streaking down her temples. The machine gun did not shift. She had practiced long enough to make every movement controlled, deliberate, unyielding to imbalance. When the burn climbed up her arms and into her lungs, she welcomed it. She moved into bear crawls across the cracked concrete, hands and feet grinding against grit. Her breath stayed measured, steady as a metronome. Each yard forward was a reminder that no bet and no mockery defined her. What mattered was whether she could do this with fire snapping past her ears, whether she could hold the line when there was no one else left to fire back. She told herself again that respect was not a prize and not something given in ceremony. It was trust, earned only when lives were saved because she did not falter. Her gloves were damp with sweat and dust when she shifted into push-ups. The pig weighed her down, arms shaking, but her form never broke. The floodlight behind her threw her shadow long and sharp across the yard, a silhouette rising and falling in rhythm like the pendulum of a clock. Between sets, she unscrewed a dented canteen, drank deep, then set it down without pause. The water was warm, metallic, and exactly what she needed. Minutes folded into an hour. The cycle repeated until her muscles trembled and then steadied again, a loop of effort and silence. No one came to watch. No one cheered. That was the point. By the time she finally eased the pig from her back, the laughter in the barracks had faded, the night air had cooled, and the only proof of her training was the dark patch of sweat on the gravel where she had pressed her palms again and again. True strength was not tested in front of a crowd. It was built here, under moonlight and dust, in the silence that no one else would ever see. The morning sun over forward operating base coast was merciless, pressing down on steel and skin until everything radiated heat. Dust hung in the air, stirred by boots and the restless wind that came down from the ridges. The base had turned the 2-kilometer challenge into entertainment. And half the company seemed to gather near the outer track to see if the woman who carried the pig on her back could keep her word. Soldiers leaned against vehicles, some waving bills, others calling out odds. The noise was rowdy, layered with laughter, the kind of scene that thrived on doubt. Maria Santos stood at the start line in full armor, her helmet straps cinched tight. The M249 sat strapped across her back, its weight familiar and steady. She did not wait for ceremony. When the first voice called to begin, she leaned forward and set her pace. Her boots struck gravel in even rhythm, crunching in the silence between jeers. At first, the mocking came freely. They said she would fold within the first 100 meters. They shouted that the pig would drag her face down in the dust. Maria did not respond, and her calm stride chipped away at the laughter faster than any words could. By the first kilometer, the mood began to shift. Her breathing was controlled. Her armor never shifted, and the pig seemed to sit like a permanent part of her frame. The heckling gave way to murmurs, and those murmurs carried something Rodriguez could not miss. His grin had tightened, his eyes narrowed, and the certainty that fueled his bet began to erode. He folded his arms, watching her close the distance with a composure that did not belong to a test, but to combat itself. Halfway through, the world broke apart with the crackle of a radio. The sudden voice cut through the crowd and ended the spectacle in a single breath. Urgent orders called for immediate support of a medical convoy under threat en route Falcon. The laughter died instantly. Officers barked commands. Boots hit dirt as soldiers scattered toward vehicles and weapons racks. The test had no finish line now. Maria halted only long enough to swing the pig forward and check its feed. She tightened the sling across her chest and moved in stride with the others as if the interruption had been planned all along. Dust swirled higher as engines roared to life, drowning out the chatter that had filled the morning air only minutes before. What had begun as a game collapsed into reality. The pig was still on her back, untested in distance but ready for what mattered. Rodriguez's bet hung unfinished, suspended in the rising noise of real urgency. Respect would not be settled by kilometers or wagers. It would be decided where lives hung in the balance, far from laughter and closer to fire. The convoy rolled out along Route Falcon under an afternoon sun that bled heat into the metal of every vehicle. Dust rose behind the wheels in long plumes, settling over helmets and rifles until everything carried the same color as the barren hills. Maria Santos rode in the third truck, her eyes scanning the ridges. The pig rested across her lap, its weight steady, its barrel ready. Something gnawed at her as the kilometers passed. There were no birds in the sky, no echoes of goats from the distant village. The silence was too complete, as if the land itself held its breath. Her shoulders stiffened, instinct crawling up her spine. She opened her mouth to warn, but the explosion came first. An RPG streaked from the ridge, its white trail cutting across the sky before slamming into the lead truck. The world erupted in gunfire, sharp bursts of PKMs cracking from both sides of the valley. Dirt sprayed across her face as bullets tore into the road. The convoy halted, pinned in the kill zone. Davis, the M240 gunner, swung up to return fire but collapsed in seconds, blood blooming across his vest. Maria's eyes locked on the empty gun nest. She did not wait for orders. Slinging the pig across her chest, she vaulted from her seat and sprinted into the open. Boots pounded against hard dirt. Bullets snapped past her helmet, kicking dust into her vision. Someone shouted for her to get back, but she ignored it, lungs burning as she covered the ground. She dropped behind the shattered wall beside Davis, dragged him clear, and set the pig on its bipod. The first burst tore through the ridgeline, suppressing the gunners that had held the convoy in place. She adjusted fire with each controlled pull, chewing holes into the rocks where muzzle flashes had danced. The pig roared, the belt feeding smooth, her rhythm unbroken. Vehicles lurched forward, drivers seizing the moment to push through. She kept the pressure constant until the last truck cleared the ambush zone. When the firing ebbed and the convoy regrouped on safe ground, Maria stood with sweat and dust streaking her face, the pig still hot against her gloves. Rodriguez walked toward her without speaking. He pulled a folded $100 bill from his pocket, pressed it into her hand, and turned away. The crowd of soldiers who had laughed at wagers now understood the truth. The game had ended in the dust and fire, and Maria Santos had proved herself where it mattered. The briefing had promised a swift strike. Intelligence claimed the compound held only a handful of fighters guarding Qasim, a mid-level Taliban leader. 2 Blackhawks lifted into the Afghan dusk with squads packed tight, the rotor wash fading into the desert as night pressed in. The insertion was quick, boots pounding dirt, weapons raised, but the first burst of gunfire shattered the illusion of an easy raid. What should have been a minor target revealed itself as a training camp, swarming with 30 fighters, rifles flashing from doorways and ridgelines. Chaos split the squad before anyone could regroup. Maria Santos ducked behind a crumbled wall, the pig biting into her shoulder as rounds chipped stone around her. Orders blurred in the roar of gunfire, but instinct drove her to move. She spotted the higher roof of a half-collapsed building at the compound's center. Without hesitation, she slung the pig tight and sprinted across the open stretch, boots hammering dirt, tracer fire whipping past in streaks of green. She pulled herself up by a splintered beam, the pig dragging heavy but steady, until she rolled onto the rooftop. From that perch the battlefield opened wide. She pressed the pig to its bipod, eyes scanning the lines of muzzle flash below. The first target was a PKM gunner raking fire across her squad. She squeezed the trigger, and the pig roared, sending a line of fire that silenced him in seconds. She shifted, tracked another glint from a doorway, and cut it down before the gunner could fire more than 2 bursts. Every shot she called over the radio, her calm voice guiding teammates pinned behind low walls. Muzzle flashes lit her rooftop edge like lightning, each burst painting her silhouette in stark flashes of orange. Tracer fire streaked through the night in angry arcs, but she held her ground, shifting position with practiced rhythm. Below, her squad clung to cover, every move dictated by the suppressive weight she kept pouring into the enemy. The tide began to shift as her fire carved openings where none had existed. Minutes dragged like hours, but she never let the rhythm break. Then, distant, but unmistakable, came the thunder of Apache rotors. The gunships swept in low, missiles tearing through fortified walls, cannons shredding positions she had already marked. The enemy scattered under the combined assault. When the dust settled, the camp lay destroyed, and every American stood alive. Williams, who had once mocked her the loudest, climbed onto the rooftop as smoke curled skyward. He looked at the empty belt boxes scattered around her and shook his head in disbelief. His voice carried not mockery, but awe when he said she had fought like a one-woman army. Maria only reset the pig on safe and scanned the ridges again, her expression unchanged, as if victory itself was only another duty carried out. Morning broke over Route Copper with a hard light that painted the ridges in long black shadows. The convoy rolled in slow formation, engines echoing between stone walls. Maria Santos sat in her vehicle with the pig across her lap, scanning the emptiness. The valley floor was bare, too neat, as if someone had swept it clean. No herders moved along the paths, no children ran near the scattered ruins, and not even a bird broke the sky. The silence pressed in so heavily it set her teeth on edge. She leaned forward, speaking low to Rodriguez through the headset. Something about this place was wrong. It was too perfect, too controlled, and she felt it like a prickle at the base of her neck. Morrison dismissed her concern with a chuckle, saying the valley was a gift, the easiest patrol they would ever run. Rodriguez backed him with a shrug, calling it paranoia. Maria gripped the pig tighter, eyes locked on the ridgeline. Every instinct told her they were walking straight into teeth. The lead truck passed the midpoint when the first boulder cracked loose from above. It thundered down, smashing across the road and blocking the exit in a cloud of dust. Maria swore under her breath, already swinging the pig into position. The first RPG fired before the dust even settled, its smoke trail slicing the air before slamming into the flank of a vehicle. Flames licked upward as gunfire poured from the ridges, PKM bursts hammering the convoy from both sides. The valley became a cage in an instant. Echoes bounced off rock walls, doubling the roar until it seemed fire came from everywhere. Shrapnel and dirt rained across helmets. Vehicles ground to a halt, boxed in by the rock slide and overlapping fire. Maria fired back, the pig answering with heavy bursts, but the ridges swarmed with muzzle flashes. Rodriguez barked orders to return fire, his earlier grin erased. Morrison shouted about low ammo, his voice strained with disbelief. Maria kept her stance calm, feeding belt after belt, each burst trying to carve a path through the wall of fire. Yet she knew what they all now realized too late. The valley had been waiting for them, prepared for every step, and air support was still half an hour away. The silence she had noticed earlier had not been emptiness. It had been the pause before eruption, the breath before slaughter. They were trapped, and only grit and instinct would decide who walked out alive. The valley shook with fire and echoes, every ridge alive with muzzle flashes. The convoy was pinned in place, wounded, calling for medics while bullets shredded the dirt around them. Rodriguez shouted for everyone to stay low and conserve ammunition. But Maria Santos ignored the order. Bacalawan. She pulled the pig tight across her chest and sprinted for an exposed rise that overlooked the kill zone. Dust kicked at her boots as she climbed, rounds snapping overhead, yet she never slowed. She dropped flat at the crest, slammed the bipod into the dirt, and opened fire. The pig roared, its first bursts tearing into the ridge where enemy gunners had fixed their fire on the convoy. One position fell, then another. Maria shifted without pause, her controlled bursts cutting through 15 different nests across the valley walls. The pig's barrel glowed red, the heat shimmering in the rising dust. Shrapnel sliced her cheek, leaving a hot line of blood, but she never flinched. Below, medics dragged the wounded into cover. Each time they exposed themselves, Maria's fire raked the ridges, cutting down fighters before they could fire RPGs into the trapped vehicles. She saw one launcher rise above a boulder, pivoting toward the convoy, and sent a burst that shattered it before it could launch. Rodriguez's voice on the radio had shifted from anger to disbelief, his orders drowned by the relentless rhythm of her fire. Minutes became an hour, then another. Her arms burned, her back ached, and sweat poured down her armor. But still she fed the pig belt after belt. When the barrel overheated, she swapped it with bare hands, searing her gloves and palms but refusing to let the weapon die. The air reeked of cordite, every pull of the trigger matched by the shriek of metal and the echo of stone collapsing under fire. Her last belt slid into place as the enemy pressed harder, shadows surging down the ridges, their voices rising in shouts that drowned the gunfire. Maria braced the pig tight, every muscle screaming as she fired again. Dust and smoke swirled around her, curling off the weapon as if it exhaled with her. She knew the belt was almost gone. She knew when it ended she would have nothing left but her sidearm and grit. Still, she held the line, the silhouette of one soldier against a storm of dust and fire. The final rounds ripped from the chamber, echoing louder than all that had come before. And just as silence threatened to swallow her, the deep thrum of Apaches rolled through the valley. The gunships streaked overhead, missiles tearing into the ridges, cannons shredding the last resistance. Maria lowered the pig at last, smoke rising from its barrel, her cheeks streaked with blood and dust. The line had held because she had refused to break. The convoy limped back into forward operating base coast under a veil of exhaustion and disbelief. Vehicles were scorched, windshields cracked, armor dented from the storm of fire they had driven through, yet every seat still carried someone breathing. 7 were wounded, some wrapped in makeshift bandages and IV lines. But no lives had been lost. That miracle carried one clear name among the soldiers, and word of it spread before the engines cooled. In the hours that followed, Maria Santos found herself at the center of something she had never asked for. Men who had mocked her lined up outside the medical tent where she sat on a crate with the pig leaning against her knee. Davis, pale but conscious, was the first to speak. His eyes brimmed when he said she had given him back to his daughter. His voice broke before he could finish, and he gripped her hand with a pressure that spoke more than words. Others followed, some offering quiet thanks, others too overcome to speak at all. Each look carried the same weight, recognition carved by survival. Later in the debrief room, the fluorescent lights flickered while Colonel Patterson studied the gun camera footage from the Apaches. He leaned back slowly, his voice measured but heavy. He said the overhead view showed one figure holding the rise alone, firing as if she were a full squad by herself. He told the assembled officers that her discipline had preserved the convoy and bought the time for air support to arrive. There was no debate left in the room after that. Days later, under a sun that made the parade ground shimmer, the ceremony was called. The silver star gleamed against its ribbon as it was pinned to her chest. Rows of soldiers stood at attention, dust clinging to their boots, their silence more powerful than applause. Rodriguez stepped forward after the medal was fixed in place. His words were clear enough for every man and woman present to hear. He admitted they had been dead wrong. That courage never came in a size or shape, but only from the heart. Maria did not flinch or bow her head. She stood stiff under the weight of the medal, the pig still resting in its sling by her side, the familiar burden more comfortable than the polished star pinned to her uniform. Her eyes held steady, but behind them was a quiet discomfort, the unease of a soldier who never wanted a spotlight. Respect had been earned, but it felt heavier than the pig itself. The crowd's voices carried outward after the ceremony, layered with admiration, but Maria gave them nothing more than silence. In that silence lay the truth she carried. Recognition was never the goal. Service itself was the weight, and she bore it as she always had, without complaint, without pride, and without surrender. The afternoon sun burned steady over the training yard, bleaching the sky into a pale wash and filling the air with a faint haze of dust. New arrivals lined the fence, their uniforms stiff, their faces a mix of eagerness and doubt. Most kept their voices low, but Maria Santos heard the whispers clearly enough. They said she was too small for the weapon slung across her shoulder. They smirked as if waiting for her to prove their assumptions correct. It was the same sound she had heard once before, and it no longer stung. She set the pig down in the gravel with deliberate calm. Her voice carried evenly when she told them the weapon did not care about size or strength. It only cared whether the one holding it knew how to use it. A few recruits laughed softly under their breath, but the sound faded as she picked up the weapon again and demonstrated. Her stance was steady, her shoulders square, her movements precise. Every adjustment of her grip, every controlled burst that tore through the target, showed that mastery was not measured in appearance but in discipline. The pig passed from one set of hands to another as she guided them. Some recruits struggled to keep the barrel up, their arms trembling. Maria corrected them patiently, showing how to lean into the weight, how to control recoil with posture instead of raw power. Dust swirled with each shift of boots, clinging to uniforms and skin, the afternoon heat pressing down until sweat ran freely. She kept her instructions simple, her tone steady, every word grounded in experience carved from fire. Rodriguez stood off to the side, arms folded, his face unreadable until the last recruit shouldered the pig without faltering. He walked closer and lowered his voice so only she could hear. He told her she was a legend now, the kind of soldier whose name would outlast their time in the desert. Maria shook her head slightly, her expression unchanged. She answered that she only wanted to be the kind of soldier who brought everyone home. The words settled over the yard more firmly than any lecture. The recruits looked at her differently now, their smirks gone, their eyes carrying the weight of something they had not expected to see. The pig rested again at her side. Not just a weapon, but a burden, turned symbol. Its steel bearing the proof of everything it had endured with her. Dust curled around her boots, catching the sunlight in thin golden spirals as the drills resumed. Her legacy was not pinned to her chest or told in ceremony. It lived in the way she passed the weapon across to the next soldier, in the discipline she demanded, in the survival they would one day owe to lessons learned here. Silence carried it forward, the same silence that had always been her strength.